Video games constantly lie and trick you in like every single game and without you even knowing. Who, me? Yes, you, the player. Things like how platforms are much bigger than you actually see, how computer players cheat, quote unquote, or even that your health bars don't even display the right amount of health. But not to worry guys, because it's actually good that games lie in the scenarios I'm talking about today. Well, except for the last trick in this video here, which is the only one that I don't really like, because it's a bit misleading. What do I mean by that? Well, I think it's just easier if I show you some of these techniques, starting with the first trick we're looking at. Lighting and reflections are things that are very intensive for the hardware of your computer or console. So developers will often have to fake both of these effects to create an illusion of various lighting conditions. One way that this is done is by creating a duplicate of the environment and then show that duplicate in the reflections. This is very commonly seen for mirrors in games, which are really more like windows instead of mirrors. Or there's these floors in Pokemon XD, for example, that just have the same environment under the floor, and then the floor itself was made to be slightly transparent, which creates this awesome shiny reflection illusion. Another way of doing this is by simply painting the lighting effects onto the actual textures themselves. A good example of this is in the Serena Beach level in Mario Sunshine. This level has a unique sunset setting, so to really sell this whole vibe, they essentially drew a bunch of shadows on the various pieces of the environment. And this works because none of the shadows move during this level. And those are some pretty cool concepts to start with. But now let's move on to a trick that is pretty well used in all platformer games, and this is just because it makes them feel way better to play. And this is that every platform is slightly bigger than what you're seeing on screen. Well, not really, but this trick essentially achieves that effect. Basically, what's actually happening is that the developers give players a few extra frames to input a jump, even after sliding off a platform, and it will still register as a jump, like you're still on that solid surface. This allows the player to have a bit of extra wiggle room when jumping off a platform. This concept has actually been given the hilarious name of Coyote Time, based on Wile E. Coyote in the Looney Tunes cartoons, since he would often run on air for a little bit when leaving a surface in those episodes. And that is exactly what this looks like in these platformer games. This is actually so odd because you would think by doing this you're just making the game too easy, but in reality it just makes the game feel right. There has actually been a lot of playtests where people try and play a game with and without Coyote Time, and in most cases, the games without Coyote Time, people said that they felt cheated or that their jumps didn't register in these games. This is often why old NES platformers feel very clunky or unfair at times, when in reality, those games were just too fair and didn't give you that extra time to jump. Now let's look at a common trick used in the first-person shooter genre, and that is the fact that your guns that you see don't actually exist within the 3D video game space, and are all just really fake. And not just the gun, but everything you see of your character isn't what actually is in the video game space. But all of this is rather just used as a visual for the player so they get a sense of what their character is doing in the multiplayer match. There's a few reasons why developers chose to do it this way. One reason is because your guns often stick way out of your player's collision box and will often go into walls. While this is still visible to another player, you won't actually see this in first person, since the gun you're looking at is on the top layer of sorts in the player's view. But then another big reason for this is due to hip firing, i.e. shooting the gun while not aiming down the sight. See, your gun here is off to the side, so the player can, well, see in front of him. So technically, if you were actually shooting from this angle, then all your bullets wouldn't come out straight, but rather travel in the direction where the gun is pointing. This is most noticeable in laser-type weapons, since from the first person, you can clearly see the beam traveling at an angle, while a second player sees the beam coming out perfectly straight. You can even kind of break this illusion by shooting close close to a wall in which the laser will seemingly go through that wall, because in reality, the laser isn't actually coming from that angle. And hey, side note, if you're enjoying this video so far, let me know by subscribing, because there is definitely a lot more to come. Thanks. Here's an odd one, but did you know in certain games, the difficulty will actually change and adjust itself seamlessly without the player even knowing, and while the player continues to play that game? See, the goal of the game developer is to keep the player playing their game, right? So if the game is getting frustratingly difficult or boringly easy, then the player may have the urge to quit playing. That's why in some games, developers will actually make the game harder if the player is breezing through it, and make the game easier if, well, the player is sucking at a certain section. Resident Evil 4 is probably the best example of this and is done super well, affecting things like the amount of enemies, enemy health, and even how aggressive their behavior is toward the player. A good visual representation of this in the game is in the water room, where normally, along with the other enemies, there will be 2 crossbow snipers up here as well. But if you die enough times, then both of these snipers will simply just not be placed in this room anymore. This next trick here achieves a similar effect as the difficulty changing one that we just looked at. However, this one is totally exclusive to racing games. And it is definitely more known than a lot of the other tricks in this video due to just how often it is used in these games. I'm talking about the term rubber band AI. Quite a simple trick, but a very effective one. Basically, if you're doing well in a race and have a big lead, then all the other computer racers will get a speed boost so they don't fall too behind. But if you happen to fall behind in a race and are doing poorly, then all the other computer players will slow down, allowing you to catch up. Take a look at this comparison I made in Mario Kart of how fast the characters are moving along on the minimap. On the left, I didn't move at all, and on the right, I am trying my hardest to keep first place. Yeah, I know that sounds pretty cheap, and it kinda is, but this makes it so all the races feel a lot more tense now since you're always in the middle of the action. And that definitely helps the gameplay of, say, kart racing games, where throwing items at opponents are a big part of it. This next trick I learned about recently, and I actually found it to be pretty fascinating. And this is the fact that in many games, your health bar actually lies to you, and it is purposely inaccurate in those games. Like, let's take the Legend of Zelda health bar. Now, I don't think this actually happens in the Zelda series, but I'm just using it here as the example. These 2 sections of health are not actually the same, despite each of them only having 3 hearts. It would be more closer to something like this, where the last 2 hearts are actually worth double the amount as the first bit of health. So basically, in certain games, the last bit of your health bar is actually worth more hit points than the very start of your health bar. This has been confirmed to be used in series like Doom or Assassin's Creed. But why would devs do this then? Well, it's mainly because they want the player to simply feel awesome here. So it makes enemy encounters a lot more tense and epic when the player thinks that they just survived by their last bit of health. But that is not the only way a game can be manipulated so a player survives at a low health percentage, because there is another way that this same effect can be achieved. Rather than tweaking the player's health, other games will actually change enemies' bullets to get the same effect of feeling like you're just barely hanging on. For example, let's say it takes 4 bullets to kill a player and the player has 100 health points. One would think that each bullet would do 25 points of health, right? But no, actually. Instead, developers would make the shots do like 33 health points. So if the player takes 1, 2, 3 shots, then in both scenarios, only 1 more shot would kill the player. But by making it do 33 damage, after the 3rd shot, the player would only have 1 point of health rather than 25. This is all just a psychological way of, again, making the player feel like he just hung on with a super small percentage of health, when in reality, the game is just designed to be like that. Listen, one thing that all of us gamers can hopefully agree on is that loading screens suck. So, while we don't have the technology to remove them altogether, developers will actually cleverly hide their loading screens in plain sight. Like, you know, all those games that have a slow section where the player may be squeezing through like a small gap at an incredibly slow pace? Welp, this wasn't a creative choice, this is just a way to slow the player down while the game loads the next area. Like, ever wonder why there's this long vent you have to crawl through in Arkham Asylum before you get to the big outdoor shot with a lot of detail? Well, it's because the game was loading. Another common way of hiding loading screens is through elevators, and I personally really noticed this when playing Resident Evil 8 last year. Since the game came out on both last gen and next gen consoles, the elevator rides on the original PS4 model, for example, are a lot longer than the elevators in the PS5 version. Which doesn't always make sense when you see the height of the elevators, but it makes complete sense from a developer perspective. And finally, here we are with the very last trick in this video, the one I actually don't really like. And this is because it's used to manipulate how good a player is in online multiplayer matches. Yeah, I'm just gonna be blunt, but some online multiplayer games will actually boost a player's gun damage if it is their first match in this game. This has been confirmed to have been used in the Gears of War games. And the reason they started doing this is because they found that 90% of players who didn't get a kill in their first match wouldn't play a second one. Not sure if they're talking about just the first match, like ever, and that's it, or the first match every time the player signs on and plays the game, but still. Now, I know it is only one match, and it is a smart decision from a business perspective, but this still gives that player a completely unfair advantage over all the other players in the lobby, and only attempts to keep the player interested with a false sense of being better than the other players. So yeah, it doesn't sound so great now. But other than that, the tricks in this video I found to be very fascinating. Let me know if you knew about these, or if this is all new to you, and I'll see you guys next time.